You've been living abroad for so long, there's no point in getting property in the States, right? It's enough for you to have our grandparents' old house.
After my mother passed away, I returned to my home country for her funeral, only to find out that my sister had already decided on the inheritance distribution without consulting with me. There were no room for me to say my opinion, and I was given the old house that our grandparents used to live in. When I went to see it, it was in no condition to be inhabited. Even if I wanted to dispose of it, it seemed like it would cost a considerable amount of money. However, I started cleaning it up because it was a house that my mother cherished from our grandparents. And there, I found something unbelievable. I am in my 40s and married. My husband got a job overseas, and I accompanied him. I can work from anywhere as long as there is an internet connection, so I didn't hesitate to go with him. I currently work as a freelancer. I have one sister, and she is also married and has family of her own. My sister's husband works in the countryside, so they enjoyed living in the suburbs, which was closer to his workplace. After both my sister and I got married, our parents were still in good health for a while, but a few years ago, our father passed away. My parents had a very good relationship, and my mother, who lost her husband, became depressed and felt sick. Ideally, my sister and I should have discussed what to do with our mother, but my sister took action on her own. My sister and I never got along from a young age, and we had never cooperated on anything. My sister left her husband behind in the countryside and returned to our family home alone. Effectively, my sister's husband lived away from home for work. My sister started living with my mother in the family home. It might be normal for me to offer financial support since I couldn't return home, but we had not talked to each other at all even for my father's funeral. I've heard nothing about my mother and sister living together. While the relationship between the sisters was not good, my sister and mother did not have any conflicts. As long as they were getting along fine, I refrained from contacting them. However, my mother's depression worsened, and she fell ill, eventually passing away. I rushed back to my home country to attend the funeral. I should have seen her again while she was still healthy. I cannot help regretting not returning to my home country and living with my mother. Even though it was only a short time since the funeral, my sister brought a lawyer and started talking about the inheritance.
You're living overseas, so you don't need the inheritance, right? I took care of Mom until the end. You know what I mean, don't you?
It seemed like my sister already knew the amount of property left by our mother. Seeing that she had a lawyer with her, I thought she wouldn't let me regut.
But if I take everything, my public image gets worse, right? So I'll give you the old house where our grandparents used to live.
That was referring to the house that had been more than 100 years old, where our grandparents had lived. I remembered my mother taking over the management of it after our grandparents passed away. However, I had never been directly informed about it by my mother. According to the lawyer, it seemed that my mother, who lost her husband and became depressed, did not actively manage the house. So the lawyer suggested that I could abandon it because I couldn't understand the situation. Maybe the lawyer is exaggerating to make me abandon it. Although I had suspicions like that, no matter how bad the condition was, if it was a house that my mother had managed as long as her health allowed, I decided to accept my sister's proposal and take over. This was the only inheritance I received. In contrast, my sister inherited the family home, land, and all of my mother's savings. The house I inherited was a typical American style, and it is a place where I used to come and play often during my childhood, running around in the natural surroundings and playing hide and seek. Even though I didn't get along with my sister, we used to visit there quite often, but she hated our grandparents' house. She detested the old-fashioned countryside surrounding with bugs. Furthermore, our grandparents' house was dimly lit even during the day, and it was packed with stuff, which made it spooky, so she didn't want to get close to it. For me, there are only good memories, but for my sister, it was a place she didn't want to get close, so I assumed she pushed it onto me. I thought so since the condition of the house was way too worse than I expected because quite some time had passed since my mother couldn't manage it anymore. First of all, the surrounding weeds were taller than me. These weeds blocked my view, and there were overgrown branches and roots that obstructed my path, making it difficult for me to even get inside. Without checking the condition of the house, I could easily estimate the extent of its deterioration. Still, I need to check thoroughly. Is it in a condition that can be preserved? Can it be repaired? Or is it so dilapidated that it would be a nuisance to the neighbors if not demolished? I initially thought I could handle it by my own hand, but I was completely helpless. I cannot imagine how much time and effort to take by myself. Anyway, I entrusted a contractor to remove the overgrown weeds and trees obstructing my way so that I could at least reach inside of the house. A few days later, I received a message saying that the removal of the designated areas was completed. I headed back to my grandparents' house and was finally able to see the house itself. The exterior was not in good condition, so I realized that it had to be demolished without consulting experts. The inside was worse than the impression I got from the exterior. The carpets were worn out, there were holes in the roof, rain had leaked through and damaged the carpets and floorboards. There were even places that creaked loudly under my weight, making it difficult to thoroughly inspect every room. At a glance, it seemed like the items inside the house had been organized compared to my childhood memories. I'm sure my mother gradually organized the items inside the house after inheriting it until she got sick. Still, there were many pieces of furniture and small items left behind. Although I thought it would be fine as it was, since I planned to demolish it, I decided to clean it up as much as possible. When I consulted a contractor, they said it would take several days at the earliest, or maybe more, even a few weeks. They said that the surrounding trees were obstructing the entry of heavy machinery, so we needed to start with that. So, during the weeks leading up to the demolition, I decided to visit my grandparents' house as much as possible on sunny days. One day, while cleaning around the kitchen, something interesting happened. It seemed like no one had touched the items around the kitchen, as many cooking utensils and dishes remained as they were. There were no food items left, of course, but there were some unopened seasonings that had passed their expiration dates. I wondered if there might be something in the storage space under the floor. As expected, a fermentation crock jar emerged when I opened it. My grandmother used to make pickles often. Especially her homemade shiso plum pickles were super good, and there was a time when she sent them to me regularly, even after I stopped visiting her. I couldn't believe that there were still pickles left. I tried to lift the jar cautiously, but it was quite heavy. Moreover, it seemed certain that something was inside. Could it be that there are actually pickles inside? I nervously opened the jar, and various gold items came out. There were documents with them, and it turned out that they had been purchased with the money our grandparents obtained from selling the land. While I inherited my grandparents' house, should I also take the gold items inside the house? Since it seemed like a dispute might arise if I told my sister, I decided to consult with my mother's sister, my aunt. According to my aunt, it was true that our grandparents had sold part of the land where our ancestors had inherited for generations. The only remaining land was the one where our grandparents' house was built. My aunt had her own health issues, and she couldn't handle the family home, so she entrusted everything to me because I was the one who inherited it. Regarding the gold items, she said she would give them to me as a fee for the trouble and inconvenience, which might happen by leaving everything entirely to me. In fact, it would cost several $10,000 to demolish the old house. Since saying I'll pay for it from the money I earn by selling the land wouldn't work, I decided to accept my aunt's proposal. Now, since the price of gold is soaring, so there will be some money left even after allocating funds for the demolition costs, removal of surrounding weeds, and disposal of unwanted items inside. As expected, when I exchanged it for cash, they bought it for an amount higher than I had anticipated. I used the funds for the house demolition expenses, clearing the surrounding weeds, and disposing of the unwanted items inside. On the day of the demolition, I decided to see through it until the end. For me, it held childhood memories of my grandparents, but for my aunt, it was the house where she was born and raised. While standing beside me, my aunt softly said, "I'm sorry for letting it deteriorate like this." "Not at all. I'm sure Grandpa, Grandma, and Mom would be thankful that you were here till the end," I told her. "I'm glad it was you, my niece, who inherited it in the end," she responded. I felt relieved that I could fulfill what my mother had left undone. Once everything was settled, I returned to my husband waiting overseas. Then, a year after my mother passed away, my husband and I returned to our home country for her first memorial service. It was the first time I had seen my sister since the one-sided discussion about the inheritance. After finishing the event, my sister asked me, what happened to the shabby house? I explained to her that I had it demolished and turned into an empty lot because I thought I didn't need to hide the truth from her. The land where my grandparents' house had stood turned out to be quite spacious once it was cleared, and we found a buyer promptly. However, my sister's expression changed. She said, "I haven't heard of it."
I didn't hear about any of this. If you've any cash by selling it, you should give me half. If I had known that this shabby house could be worth something, I wouldn't have let you inherit it.
Certainly, if we only consider the rundown condition of the house, it wouldn't have been worth much. It became valuable only after I invested a significant amount in turning it into an empty lot. However, I didn't mention that we had cashed in the gold items left by our grandparents and used that money for the expenses. If I did, she would undoubtedly ask for a share of that too. I firmly rejected my sister's demand. It was such unequal inheritance from the beginning. I didn't see any reason to split the funds I had earned by selling it, especially since it was a result of my efforts. If she insisted on splitting it in half, I suggested that she should first hand over half of the inheritance she had received to me. But my sister seemed to despise my opinion and began to blame me, saying, "You are such a greedy miser. You acted selfishly by demolishing and selling the property without any permission." She insisted I earned the cash unfairly. My aunt defended me, saying that she had requested to stay at the family home until the end. Being in a clear position on my side, my aunt strongly counted my sister. My sister, enraged by this, exclaimed, "Outsiders should step back, don't interfere in the sisters' conversation," and forcefully pushed her. My aunt stumbled and fell. I told my sister, "How could you do that?" But she shifted the blame onto me, saying that I had acted recklessly. She even suggested, "The fallen old woman is an obstacle. Why don't the two couples, sisters and husbands, discuss together?" We ended up in a separate room, where my husband and I faced my sister and her husband. Initially, my husband explained how I had dedicated myself to managing our family affairs after my mother passed away. Leaving my husband behind in the overseas for an extended period due to work commitments, I stayed in New York alone until the sale of the vacant lot was completed. Fortunately, we found a buyer sooner than expected, but if not, I would have had to return home more frequently. While my job allows me to work from anywhere as long as I have an internet connection and a computer, it's not as easy as having things go my way all the time. There were also time differences to communicate with my husband, so to be honest, it wasn't easy. My husband also told my sister about the considerable initial investment I had made in preparing the vacant lot. He didn't disclose the source of the funds, but made it clear that if she insisted on splitting everything in half, we should also divide the incurred expenses equally. Furthermore, he argued that the discussion should have started from that point, and that we had no intention of handing over half of the proceeds from the sale of the land. My sister had already received an inheritance greater than the selling price of my land. I asked her, "What more do you want?" Our mother's inheritance hadn't been divided equally. It might be difficult to divide the land equally, but couldn't she at least have split our mother's savings equally? I also revealed my true feelings, admitting that I would have been willing to discuss things further if she had expressed dissatisfaction with the amount after splitting. In response, my sister's husband asked, "By the way, how much did my wife inherit?" My husband and I were so surprised that we asked, "Oh." My sister apparently hadn't informed her husband of the amount she had inherited. When my sister's husband found out the amount, he was shocked and asked her, "What on earth did you spend that enormous sum on?" It seemed that he knew nothing about the money, and the money had already been spent. I couldn't believe that such a large sum could disappear in just a year or so. Of course, if she had used it to purchase a house, I could understand to some extent, but after our mother's death, my sister had returned to her husband's place, where he lived for work. If she had made a major purchase like a house, her husband would have already questioned her to find out the source of the funds. At first, my sister was trying to make the conversation muddy, change the topic, and deceive, but she confessed that she spent the money to repay her debt because she seemed to be felt fear when her husband, who usually looks gentle, pressing Gare for answer with banding a table. Furthermore, since she still had an outstanding debt to repay, it appeared she desperately wanted the proceeds from the sale of the land that I had obtained. How much is the outstanding debt that couldn't be repaid with that inheritance amount? Upon closer examination, it became clear that she had incurred significant debts through illegal gambling, to the extent that it was almost enough to buy a house. The illegal interest was added to the unpaid debts day by day, making it impossible to handle. She begged for help. My sister was, in fact, a housewife, and had not worked part-time or anything of the sort. I wondered how she managed to come up with such a large amount of money. Of course, her husband questioned her harshly about this. It was then revealed that she had been using the savings they had as a couple. When her husband found out that she had been using their savings without telling him and the couple's savings account was emptied, he became furious. He grabbed my sister and pushed her down. My sister resisted, scratching her own husband with her nails. It escalated into a little scuffle, so our family members, who were in another room, came to break them up. Then my aunt said to my sister, "You've been often returning to your parents' house and taking valuable items with you, haven't you? Your mother knew about it." She then presented a letter with our mother's handwriting, saying, "Besides, she asked you to contact Emily because she wanted to her my other daughter before it's too late, but you never did. Why is this letter coming up now?" My aunt explained that she had initially intended to keep this matter to herself, hoping that my sister would reconsider her actions and start her life over again after having all inheritance. However, she couldn't bear my sister's selfish thoughts of taking even more, rather than turning her life around, even after having monopolized the inheritance. In front of the relatives, my aunt also revealed this incident, hoping that my sister would realize how terrible her actions were. Among the items my sister had taken and converted into cash, there were also family treasure that our mother cherished. Shortly thereafter, my sister's husband gave a divorce paper to my sister. He threatened to demand the entire amount she had spent if she didn't accept divorce. However, immediately afterward, she received legal documents requesting consolation in money. It turned out that the debt, which was originally incurred through risky gambling, had been borrowed from a very dangerous source, and no matter where my sister went, she was pursued by them. My sister, who had never really worked, started a part-time job, but it seemed she couldn't repay the debt through such work, and she was being threatened to take on a risky and profitable job. However, if she did it, she would end up with a criminal record. My sister's financial recklessness was entirely her own fault. As she couldn't manage her spending, she has only herself to blame. With my husband's job being relocated within New York, I returned home. We used the money from the land sale to buy a house, and we live happily together as a couple. Work is going well, and my aunt occasionally comes to check on us. Recently, she's been feeling better and regaining her health. I can only hope that this happiness continues indefinitely.